There is a moment, and every soldier in the interstellar compact knows it, when the tactical calculation completes and the answer comes back the same every time: do not go in there. The temperature reads lethal. The structure is failing. The biological entity inside has no strategic value. No treaty obligation. No rank. No name in any registry. It is, by every metric that a rational species uses to assign worth, an egg. A single, unhatched egg. I have filed 3 separate incident reports about what happened next. My commanding officer has read all 3. She called the first one incomplete. The second one implausible. The third one she simply sat down on her desk and looked at me for a long time without speaking. I don't blame her. I was there. I watched it happen. I had the sensor feed running. I have the thermal imaging, the atmospheric readings, the structural collapse timestamps. Every number lines up exactly as I recorded it. The numbers still don't explain it. What I am about to tell you is not a story about bravery. I have seen bravery. I have catalogued it, filed it, assigned it a classification tier under the Compact's commendation framework. Bravery is a rational response to a situation where the risk of action is lower than the risk of inaction. This was not that. This was something else. Something my species spent 4,000 cycles building language to avoid needing a word for, because we assumed, correctly, that no rational being would ever require one. His name was Vasquez. He was a Terran salvage operative, 3rd grade, technically under my supervision for the duration of the Kelmari surface contract. He had a crack in his faceplate that he'd patched with compound sealant and what appeared to be adhesive tape. He smelled, at all times, of something burned, not from the fire. Just from himself. As if he'd been singed somewhere earlier in life and never quite stopped. He was not supposed to be a remarkable individual. He was not supposed to be anything, really. And then, the Kelmari nesting chamber started to collapse, and one egg remained inside, and the thermal sensors spiked past the threshold where my species' nervous system simply stops transmitting signals and shuts down as a mercy, and Vasquez looked at the readings. Looked at me. Looked back at the fire. And said, with the specific tone of someone who has just decided what they're having for a meal, "Yeah, okay. I'll get it. I have reviewed that sensor log 11 times. 11 times I have watched him walk toward the fire. Every time, some part of my neural architecture expects him to stop. To turn around. To discover, as any organism eventually discovers, that there is a threshold past which the body refuses. He never stops. What you are about to hear is my account, the only account that exists, because I was the only other person present who survived long enough to write one. I still don't have a word for what he did. I've stopped looking for one. The Kelmari called it Sothvel, a word that translated, approximately, as the breathing place of futures. I had been on 6 prior Kelmari nesting contracts without incident. I had logged 47 surface hours on worlds with active geological activity. I had, twice, survived situations that my species' actuarial tables classified as non-survivable. None of that prepared me for the sound the mountain made when it decided to come apart. I should clarify, it was not a mountain. It was a volcanic extrusion column, roughly 300 meters of basalt and silicate crust stacked above a magma vent that the Kelmari survey team had, with what I can only describe as aggressive optimism, designated dormant. The nesting chamber was inside it. The eggs were inside that. And Vasquez and I were inside the nesting chamber when the vent beneath us stopped being dormant with a noise that registered on 6 of my 8 tympanic receptors simultaneously and caused the 7th to produce a sound it had never made before. A sort of wet click. Deep inside my skull. Like something politely excusing itself. That was 11 days ago. I am writing this from a medical bunk on the Orendat station with 3 of my 4 primary manipulators still bandaged and a standing order from the station physician not to access anything that might, quote, cause cognitive agitation. I am accessing this anyway. The physician is Kethan and does not understand that for my species, not writing is cognitively agitating. I need to get this down before the details start smoothing themselves into something that makes sense, because what happened does not make sense and I want the record to reflect that.
My name is Velshan Orith.
I am a survey coordinator, third ranking, employed by the Interstellar Compact's Surface Resources Division. My function on contract is documentation, negotiation, and, in theory, the safe management of non-compact personnel operating under temporary field licenses. In practice, my function on this particular contract had been to stand near Vasquez and feel a specific unease that I had not, at the time, been able to name.
I have since named it, Varithkes.
A term from my home dialect, no clean equivalent in standard. Loosely, the discomfort of standing next to something you cannot classify, and knowing your classification system is the problem. He had arrived on the Kelmari surface contract dock at 7 South via a compact labor placement, one of 3 human operatives assigned to assist the Kelmari nest wardens in cataloging the lower chamber access points. The other 2 humans, Nowak and Adeyemi, had been pulled topside 2 hours before the collapse to assist with equipment calibration.
Standard rotation. Nothing unusual. Vasquez had stayed below. He'd said he wanted to finish the grid survey on sublevel 4.
I had noted this in my log, assigned it no significance, and gone back to my own documentation work in the upper chamber.
My first indication that something was wrong was not the tremor.
Tremors on active geological sites are common enough that the Kelmari do not even register them consciously. Their nest guardians, those great copper-scaled quadrupeds with the bioluminescent dorsal crests, simply shift their weight and continue watching their clutches. My first indication was the Kelmari nest guardian in the northeast quadrant, a large female the wardens called Sev3, who lifted her head from the near hatchling clutch she was warming and made a sound I had never heard from a Kelmari before.
Not a territorial vocalization. Not the standard low resonance they use for nestmate communication. Something underneath all of that.
Something that predated language, if the Kelmari had ever had language to predate. Then, the floor moved. What followed was approximately 4 minutes of sustained geological violence that I will not attempt to reconstruct in precise sequence, because my memory of it comes in fragments, light bars shattering and scattering hot white sparks across clutch platforms, the Kelmari nest guardians doing the thing they do under threat, flattening themselves over their eggs with their crests fully deployed, which turns them into something that looks less like a living creature and more like a low-slung armored vehicle. The smell of the magma vent opening, sulfuric, yes, but underneath that something mineral and wet, like a stone that has been cut for the first time and is still steaming from the interior, and the ceiling of the nesting chamber developing, in the span of about 30 seconds, a crack that ran the full eastern length and began to widen. I made it to the upper access corridor.
The emergency seals engaged behind me.
I know this because I could feel the pressure differential through the corridor floor, a sensation my species registers through sensory nodes in our ventral surface. A shift in atmospheric pressure reads to me like temperature change reads to humans, a full-body awareness with no single point of origin. It dropped sharply. Sharply enough that I checked my suit seals on reflex, even though I was in a pressurized corridor and the seals were already confirmed.
I did not immediately realize that Vasquez was still below. I want to be precise about this. He was not trapped. The access corridor had not yet sealed completely. There was a window of perhaps 90 seconds before the automated systems would complete the isolation protocol. He had been at sublevel 4, which was an additional 40 meters below the nesting chamber floor, but the emergency access shafts were still open. He came up them. I have the sensor log.
He emerged from sublevel 4, crossed the nesting chamber floor at a jog, passed 2 exit points, and stopped. I was watching the feed from the upper corridor, because I had, by that point, accessed the station's emergency monitoring relay. The image quality was poor heat interference, particulate in the air from the ceiling fractures, but I could see him.
Standing in the nesting chamber. Looking toward the northeast quadrant.
Where Sev3 was. Or rather, where Sev3 had been. She was gone. I reviewed the timeline later. In the chaos of the initial tremor sequence, she had done what any rational organism does when the ground becomes unsurvivable. She had moved. She and 3 other nest guardians had exited through the main chamber access on the western side, which was still partially intact, taking the majority of the near hatchling clutch with them. They had not taken one egg. I do not know why. It was positioned at the far end of the northeast platform, which was the section closest to the ceiling fracture.
Perhaps Sev3 had assessed the distance and calculated correctly that she could not reach it and also reach the exit. Perhaps the first tremor had shifted it away from the main clutch and she had not registered it in the noise and heat and panic. I have asked the Kalmari Warden team, later, in debriefing, and they gave me an answer in their native register that the translation algorithm rendered as, she knew. She moved anyway. I have no framework for that. I filed it under the same heading as everything else from that day. Vasquez stood in the nesting chamber and looked at the egg. The sealing fracture at that point was producing a directed heat plume, essentially a column of superheated gas venting from the widening crack, bending downward under the chamber's circulation system, and sweeping across the northeast platform in irregular pulses. The thermal sensor on my relay was reading that platform at a temperature that I will convert to compact standard units for the record. It was approximately the temperature at which my species' primary nerve clusters begin irreversible protein denaturing. In simpler terms, a Velsha standing on that platform for more than about 30 seconds would not be walking off it. Vasquez stood at the edge of the platform. He did not have a heat suit. He had a standard-issue compact surface operational suit, which is rated for geological work, not for direct magma vent exposure. He had the cracked faceplate. He had his equipment harness, which included the usual salvage tools, plasma cutter, compression anchors, a utility line spool, and what I later identified as a personal issue thermal blanket, the kind rated for emergency bivouac on cold weather planets, which he had apparently been carrying in a side pouch because, as he later told me in the medical bay, Kalmari atmospheric readings said morning cold snaps, and I hate being cold in the morning. He looked at the egg. He looked at the thermal sensor readout on his wrist display. I could not see his expression through the faceplate, but I could see the angle of his head, and it was the angle of someone reading a number they already expected and do not find interesting. He pulled the thermal blanket out of the side pouch. I want to be clear, at this point I was in a pressurized corridor 40 meters above him and separated from the nesting chamber by a partially sealed emergency bulkhead, with a magma vent activating beneath us and a structural collapse in progress above. There was, objectively, nothing I could do. The corridor I was in was the correct place for me to be. Every compact emergency protocol I had been trained on agreed. I spent the next 40 seconds trying to override the bulkhead seal. I am not sure what I intended to accomplish. I was not equipped for what he was walking toward either. I think, and I say this as someone who categorizes their own cognition for a living, I think it was something close to what my species calls veldar, which is the specific reflex of not being willing to be the last one watching when something ends. We are not, by nature, witnesses. We are participants. It is a flaw, arguably. We lose more personnel to it than to almost any other cause. The bulkhead did not override. The seal was automated and I did not have the clearance code. On the feed, Vasquez wrapped the thermal blanket around himself like a cloak. It would do approximately nothing meaningful against that heat plume, and I believe he knew this, and stepped onto the northeast platform. The heat plume pulsed. He ducked under it. Not away from it, under it, dropping into a forward lean, and the pulse swept over his back, and I watched the thermal blanket's surface temperature spike on the overlay readout, and I watched him keep moving. He reached the egg in 11 seconds. I know this precisely because I counted the timestamp differential on the sensor log afterward, when my hands had stopped doing the thing they do when my nervous system is trying to process too many inputs at once, a rapid sequential flex of all four manipulators, very fine, very fast, that I have been told looks, to species with bilateral symmetry, like someone trying to dry their hands in a situation where there is nothing to dry. I was doing that when I watched him reach the egg. It was roughly the size of his torso. Kalmari eggs are heavily mineralized, not fragile, but not designed to be carried solo by a bipedal mammal either. He got his arms around it. He stood up. The ceiling above the northeast platform cracked through completely. Not a fracture. Not a widening. The section of ceiling above him, a slab of basalt approximately 4 meters across and, I estimate somewhere between 6 and 900 kilograms, sheared along the fracture line and came down. He moved left. The slab hit the platform where he had been standing and the platform buckled and the front half of it dropped away into the vent below, and Vasquez was at the back edge of what remained, still upright, still holding the egg.
I have replayed that sensor clip many times. The movement, the shift left, happened before the slab finished shearing. Not before it started. Before it finished. As if some part of him was making decisions at a speed that my conscious observation could not follow in real time. He crossed the remainder of the platform. The heat plume pulsed twice more. He cleared the northeast quadrant and he was back on the main chamber floor, and the egg was still in his arms and he was moving toward the access shaft. The bulkhead above me had not unsealed. He came up anyway. There was a secondary access, a maintenance shaft on the western side that I had not been monitoring, and he came up through that one and emerged into the upper corridor 6 meters from where I was standing, and the emergency lighting turned everything a flat amber orange, and he was fine. His suit surface was scorched. The thermal blanket was in several pieces still draped over him, most of it blackened to the point where the material had changed state. The egg was in his arms, and he was holding it with both hands against his chest, and the cracked faceplate now had an additional crack across the lower half. He looked at me. I was doing the thing with my manipulators. I could not stop. He said, and I have this verbatim from my personal audio log, which was running on automatic the entire time, he said, "Hey. You know where the wardens are? This thing's warm and I don't want to set it down on the floor." I did not respond for what the audio log records as 4.7 seconds. Then, I said, "Western exit. Sev3 will be outside." He said, "Great." And walked past me toward the western corridor. I stood in the upper access corridor of a collapsing nesting chamber for 4.7 more seconds before I followed him, because I needed the time, and I am still not entirely certain what I needed it for. The 7th tympanic receptor made the click sound again. Softer this time. Almost like it was settling. Sev3 took the egg from him the way my broodmother used to take things from hatchlings who had carried something too far and were starting to tremble with the effort but would not put it down. That specific gesture, full body and, "Lo, that means I have it now, you can stop." I did not know Kalmari could make that gesture. I have worked 6 contracts with them and I did not know they had that. Vasquez let her take it. He sat down on a rock. There was no ceremony in it. Not collapse, not strategic rest, not the controlled lowering that soldiers learn when they need to recover without appearing to recover. He sat down on a rock the way something sits down when it has decided that sitting is now the activity and the previous activity is complete. The thermal blanket remnants fell off him. He pulled his cracked faceplate off entirely. The vent atmosphere outside was breathable, barely, a thin cold highland air that my species finds unpleasant but survivable, and his face underneath was reddened across the cheekbones and the bridge of his nose in a way that I had not seen before on a human and which I later researched and found is called a burn flush, a vascular response to heat exposure just below the threshold of actual tissue damage. He looked, in my species' primary assessment framework, like something that had been hit. He did not look like something that had been hit and was distressed about it. He looked like something that had been hit and was mildly inconvenienced. He dug into a pocket on his suit harness and produced a small object, flat, silver, rectangular, and opened it, and the smell that came from it was something my olfactory system has no prior reference for. Bitter. Hot. Somehow also slightly sweet, in a way that seemed to contradict the bitterness rather than complement it. I identified it later from the supply manifest, a personal issue stimulant preparation, Terran origin, referred to in compact field documentation as instant coffee, and classified under the heading consumption items, non-nutritive, psychological function. Vasquez looked into the flask. "It's cold," he said. He said it to no one in particular. He drank it anyway. Sev3 had settled over the retrieved egg. 2 other nest guardians had moved close. I watched them orient toward the egg with their dorsal crests partially deployed, not fully, which would indicate threat response, but the partial deployment that, in Kalmari behavior documentation, corresponds to what the xenobiologists call resonance clustering, the physiological synchronization a nesting group enters when a clutch member has been isolated and returned. They were, if the documentation was accurate, recalibrating their collective biological field to include the egg again. They were, if I let myself use the simpler word, relieved. The lead warden, a Kalmari elder named in the contract registry as Nestvoice Theron, crossed the exterior terrain to where Vasquez was sitting and crouched down in front of him. Kalmari elders do not crouch for non-Kalmari. I had been on 6 contracts with them and I had not seen a Nestvoice crouch for anything. They have a specific posture, weight distributed across all 4 limbs, dorsal crested, neutral elevation, head angled downward, that indicates formal acknowledgement. It is typically extended toward other Kalmari elders, sometimes toward compact officials of significant rank. Theron extended it toward Vasquez. Vasquez, who was still drinking his cold coffee and, looking at nothing in particular, looked at Theron, looked at the posture, and appeared to make a rapid assessment. "You're welcome," he said. Then, after a pause, "Is there a med station nearby?" "My hands are a bit." He turned his hands over and looked at them. The palms were red. Not blistered, not yet, but red in the way that precedes blistering. "They feel weird." I crossed the terrain and told him that there was a field medical kit in the survey equipment cache and that I could treat the burn exposure. He said, "Oh, great. Yeah, thanks." I found the kit. I treated the burns. I did this methodically and I focused very carefully on the procedure, the correct solution concentration, the application temperature, the bandage tension, and I did not look at his face while I worked, and I noted the control panel texture of the equipment cache against the back of my second Reich manipulator, and the faint low vibration coming up through the ground from the still settling vent column below, and I noted all of these things with great precision. His hands were shaking slightly. Not the gross tremor of structural injury. Fine. Almost imperceptible. The kind that a body produces when it has been running on one kind of chemical signal for an extended period and the signal is fading. He was not looking at them. "I was going to ask," he said, "while I worked. The Kalmari, they always build nests inside active volcanic formations?" "They prefer geothermal stability," I said. "The heat gradient assists incubation." Ha! He considered this. So the dormant classification on the survey report was optimistic. Right. He was quiet for a moment. "So is there any chance the second chamber is still intact?" "I had a full grid survey on sublevel 4. Haven't finished yet." I stopped applying the bandage. I looked at him. He had the expression of someone asking a logistical question. Not rhetorical. Not ironic. He genuinely wanted to know about the survey data. "The second chamber is inaccessible," I said. "The access shafts have collapsed." "Yeah, figured. Just I had good data down there. Annoys me to lose it." He shrugged. One shoulder, the characteristic human gesture. "We'll have to come back with proper equipment anyway for the structural assessment. I can finish the grid then. I finished the bandage. He flexed his wrapped hands. Tested the range of motion. Appeared to find it satisfactory. "Can I ask you something?" I said. He looked up. I had not planned to ask anything. But the question was there, and it was the question that all of the clinical distance and the very careful bandage application and the precise attention to procedure had been, I now understood, serving to delay. "The egg," I said. "The Kalmari egg." What was I could not find the right word in standard. I tried 3 more and discarded them all. What was the calculation? He looked at me for a moment. His eyes forward-facing, I cannot help noting, though I have decided I will not make observations about that particular feature in this report because it has been used in too many sensationalized compact media reports about Terrans and it is cheap and reductive, and Vasquez is not a sensationalized media report, he is a person, and I refuse. His eyes had the quality that I had first noticed when he emerged from the maintenance shaft. Something I had no ready category for. Not calm, exactly. Not the calm of non-investment. More like the calm of something that has completed a decision and is no longer in the process of making it. "Calculation," he said. "The risk assessment. The decision to enter the." I gestured back at the mountain. At the still venting crack in its eastern face. He looked at the mountain.
looked back at me. There was an egg, he said. I waited. He did not continue. That is the complete answer? I said. He appeared to think about whether it was. Pretty much, he said. The platform looked stable enough to reach it. I had the blanket. I've worked hotter than that before. He paused. Okay, maybe not quite that hot. But, similar. The ceiling section, yeah, that was closer than I'd have liked. He looked at his wrapped hands. Didn't have great data on the structural integrity up there. My fault, I should have mapped the fracture lines better when I first came through. This was the moment I should probably explain about the tympanic click and why my seventh receptor makes that sound. My species processes informational overload through a layered filtering system. Each receptor layer handles a different class of stimulus, and, when a layer reaches maximum input, it produces a short-duration resonance and goes temporarily offline to prevent cascade degradation across the system. The click is the sound of that shutdown. It is, in clinical terms, a protective mechanism. It is also, in practical terms, the sound my nervous system makes when it encounters something it does not have a framework to hold. Vasquez looked at his bandaged hands. These are going to blister anyway, aren't they? Probably, yes. Annoying. He finished the cold coffee. Set the empty flask on the rock next to him. Thanks for the bandaging. You do field medicine? All compact survey coordinators are trained in basic field medicine. Right. He nodded. I usually just sort of, he made a gesture that I interpreted as manage. But, it's better when someone does it properly. Sev3 made a sound from the direction of the egg cluster. Low, resonant, the frequency that the xenobiologist's documentation described as maternal bonding resonance. All three nest guardians were pressed close together now, crests fully interlocked, and the egg was at the center of them. Vasquez looked over at them. There was something in his expression that I did not have a word for, in my language or standard or any of the 18 other languages I can access through translation memory. It was not pride. Pride has a posture, an elevation of the cephalic region and a particular set of muscle engagements around the visual organs that I am familiar with from 7 species. It was not satisfaction, which for Terence typically involves a specific softening of the facial musculature. It was something quieter. Like watching something you expected to end and it didn't end, the not ending is the whole thing. I noticed, on the rock beside his empty flask, a small object that had fallen from his harness. Rectangular. Worn at the corners. Some kind of folded material, not equipment, not functional. I looked at it longer than I should have. It had a slightly different color on one face, a warm amber brown, and there was a surface texture that indicated it had been handled many times over a long period. A photograph, I realized. A printed, physical photograph, which no one carries anymore because all image storage is digital and has been digital for 80 cycles at minimum. The image on it was not clear at the distance and angle I was viewing it from. I could see 2 faces. Not Vasquez's. Smaller. He saw me looking at it. He picked it up without comment and put it back in the harness pouch. The pouch sealed. We should report in, he said. Nowak and Adeyemi are going to think the mountain ate us. Communication array is on the survey transport, I said. Approximately 800 meters north. He stood up. His legs were steady. His hands were wrapped and slightly swollen and he picked up his equipment harness and slung it over one shoulder and began walking north, and I fell into step beside him, and we walked in silence for a while, and then, he said, "What do calamari eggs go for on the open market?" I looked at him. Asking because of literally nothing, he said immediately. Just curious. Never mind. I did not believe him. I believed him completely. I did not know which. That was, I think, the first time I caught myself doing something I had not been doing before, trying to figure out which interpretation of Vasquez was correct and finding that both were, that they occupied the same space without conflict, the way that only some things can. Above us, the mountain exhaled another long breath of steam into the highland cold. The egg was warm.
SEV-3's resonance sound carried a quarter-kilometer through the still air. Vasquez walked north, hands wrapped, flask empty, and did not look back. The incident report, when I filed it, took 14 hours to complete. Not because the events were complicated. I am a documentation professional. I document for a living. I have filed reports on seismic events, on equipment failures, on interspecies protocol violations, on 3 separate occasions where compact licensed personnel did things that the relevant safety frameworks had not anticipated and had therefore not prohibited, which is its own category of problem and one I have come to think of as the Vasquez problem retroactively, even though I did not know him yet for 2 of those 3 occasions. The report took 14 hours because I kept stopping. Not because I lacked information. I had all the information. I had the sensor logs, the thermal overlay timestamps, the atmospheric readings, the structural collapse sequence, the medical treatment record. I had everything. The report kept stopping because I would reach a Section 4, Decision Factors Leading to Non-Standard Action, or Section 7, Subject Behavior Assessment, Rational/Non-Rational Classification, and I would type a sentence and then look at what I had typed and delete it and type it differently and delete it again. I have never before had difficulty with Section 7 of a standard incident report. Section 7 asks a simple question. Did the subject's actions demonstrate rational decision-making consistent with recognized self-preservation frameworks? The answer options are yes, no, or indeterminate pending review. I selected indeterminate pending review and then deleted it. I selected no and then deleted it. I sat for 11 minutes looking at the blank field and then typed, subject's actions were consistent with an internal decision-making framework not captured by current compact classification parameters. Then, I looked at that for a while. Then, I filed it. My commanding officer, as I mentioned, read it. She called it incomplete. I sent her the sensor logs. She called me on open channel. She is HFY, a species that communicates stress primarily through pigment patterning across the upper thoracic plates, which on a voice channel I could not see, but I know her voice well enough to know that she was cycling through at least 3 patterns before she spoke. She said, he walked into a heat plume. Yes, I said. For a calamari egg. Yes. Not under orders. Not under contractual obligation. Not in response to a direct threat to himself or his team. That is accurate. A long pause. I heard her exhale. HFY respiratory systems produce a faint whistle on exhalation when the secondary passages are constricted, which happens under high cognitive load. Write it up again, she said. I need more on the decision factor section. I know, I said. I'm trying. Nowak and Adeyemi, when we reached the transport, reacted to Vasquez's condition in a way that I found instructive. Nowak looked at the wrapped hands, the scorched suit, the missing thermal blanket, and said, "Oh, for Vasquez, what did you do?" This was not a question. It had the cadence of a question but the vocal register of a statement, specifically the register that indicates the speaker has received information that confirms a pre-existing hypothesis. I got the egg, Vasquez said. Adeyemi, who was taller and who had been on the communication array when we arrived and had to step outside to receive us, looked at the bandaging and then at me and said, "How bad?" "Second-degree surface exposure on both palms," I said. "No structural damage. He will blister." Adeyemi said something in a Terran language that was not standard and that my translation memory flagged as idiomatic, which means it translated technically but not practically. The technical translation was, "This is the roof of the house." I still do not know what that means. I noted it and moved on. Nowak was already at the medical kit, pulling out the higher-grade burn materials. She had, I observed, hands that moved with the particular efficiency of someone who has done this specific task before, not in simulation, not in training, but in the specific conditions of field triage, where efficiency is not about precision but about the correct ordering of actions when multiple things need doing and some of them matter more than others. "Sit down," she said to Vasquez. He sat down. She redid my bandaging. Not because it was wrong, she said nothing about it and changed none of my application choices, only added a second cooling layer that I had not had in my kit.
But the way she did it was different from the way I had done it. I had been precise. She was also precise, but there was something additional in it, something I watched without being able to name until she finished and pressed the back of her wrist against his cheek for a moment. Not a medical assessment, nothing in the field documentation covers that gesture, and he didn't pull away and she didn't explain it and Adeyemi didn't remark on it and it lasted about 2 seconds. I have read approximately 1,600 pages of xenobehavioral documentation on Terrans since returning to Orindath Station. I found the gesture eventually, in a social behavior compendium, casual physical contact as reassurance transfer, intragroup, non-erotic. The documentation's description was clinically accurate and completely missed the point. I watched Vasquez's face during those 2 seconds. The expression that had been there since he sat down on the rock, the one I had no word for, the completed decision quietness, softened slightly. Just slightly. Like a reading that was already low dropping one more increment. He was not invulnerable. I had not thought he was invulnerable, but I had not thought about what the opposite of invulnerable looked like on him either. The 2 seconds ended. Nowak went back to the second cooling layer. Vasquez looked at the mountain, which was still venting steam and long slow exhalations, and said, "We should probably relocate the survey base camp. I don't trust that northeast face." "You don't trust it now," Adeyemi said, from the communication array. "I didn't fully trust it before," Vasquez said. "But now I really don't trust it." "What changed?" Vasquez looked at his wrapped hands. "I was inside it," he said. "The Compact's Incident Review Board convened 12 days after the collapse. Standard procedure when a geological destabilization event results in significant infrastructure damage and personal injury requiring medical intervention. I submitted the revised report, Section 7 still classified as indeterminate, because my commanding officer accepted that on the second pass, though she had opinions about it, and was called to give supplementary testimony. The board was composed of 5 members, 2 Sethkai, 1 Velsha like myself, 1 Irendi, and 1 Terran representative from the Compact's Human Affairs Office. Her name was Ferreira and she was there, I understood, not primarily for the geological incident review but because any incident involving Terran personnel in non-standard risk situations generates an automatic human affairs flag. She had reviewed the sensor logs before the session. I could tell because she had the sensor timeline pulled up on her personal display when I entered, and she had made several notations at specific timestamps. The board ran through the standard sequence, geological conditions leading to the event, assessment of the survey team's preparedness, structural integrity of the monitoring systems. I answered everything correctly. The technical portion took 40 minutes. Then, the chair, one of the Sethkai, asked about Section 7. I explained my reasoning for the indeterminate classification. I explained the lack of applicable framework. I explained the sensor log data and what it showed about the timeline of Vasquez's movement relative to the ceiling slab's shearing sequence. I explained the thermal readings. When I finished, the board chair said, "And, in your professional assessment, was the subject's risk-to-benefit calculation sound?" Ferreira, from the Human Affairs chair, looked up from her display. I said, "I do not believe a risk-to-benefit calculation was the operative factor." What was the operative factor? I had thought about this for 12 days. I had looked at it from every classification angle I knew. I had reviewed the xenobehavioral literature. I had asked Nowak, in the medical bay, while she was changing her own dressings on a minor hand injury she'd sustained during the equipment calibration work. She had given me a look, a specific look, one I had learned to recognize as the look a Terran gives when they are about to say something that they consider obvious but have become aware the other party does not find obvious, and said, he saw something alive that needed help and he had a shot at it. That's it. That's the whole thing. I had not found that satisfying, at the time. In my professional assessment, I said to the board, the subject operated according to a decision framework in which the condition of being able to act and the existence of a need constitute, together, a sufficient reason for action. The risk calculus was present, he made specific adaptations, he used available materials, he assessed structural conditions in real time, but the threshold question, the question of whether to act at all, appears to have been resolved prior to the risk calculation rather than emerging from it. Silence in the chamber.
The Irendi board member, the Irendi do not speak often in formal settings, preferring chemical signal communication which does not transmit over standard chamber audio, but they understand spoken language fully, shifted in their seat. That is, for the Irendi, equivalent to a strong verbal response. The board chair said, meaning what, exactly, in practical terms? I thought about Vasquez on the rock, holding the cold coffee, looking at his bandaged hands with the expression of someone mildly inconvenienced by something they would do the same way again. Meaning, I said, that for the subject, the question of whether to go in was not the same question as whether he could survive going in. The first question appears to have been settled independently of the second. Ferreira set down her stylus. She looked at me. She had eyes that did the thing. I was not going to note this in my report, but I am noting it here, privately, because I have decided to stop pretending it is not a relevant data point. Eyes that had a quality of looking at you in a way that made the being looked at feel like information transfer rather than assessment. Like she was recognizing something rather than evaluating it. She said, "That's a very accurate description." The board chair asked her to elaborate. She said, "He saw the egg. The rest was problem solving." She tapped the sensor timeline on her display. Watched the clip again. He doesn't hesitate at the platform edge. The hesitation people read as pause is actually him reading the heat plume cycle, timing his entry. He'd already decided to go. He was just working out the how. That is, the board chair started. Yes, Ferreira said. I know. She looked at the timeline for a moment. They're all like that, she said. Mostly. The good ones. Vasquez was cleared for return to field duty 11 days later. His palms had blistered, as predicted. He'd spent the recovery period, according to the medical bay log, reading structural geology documentation on his personal unit and filing a supplementary survey report for sublevel 4 based on the data he'd collected before the collapse. The sublevel 4 data, it turned out, was significant. There was a secondary geothermal channel running beneath the Kelmari nesting site that the initial survey had not identified, the kind of finding that, if acted on, would allow the Kelmari warden team to reinforce the nesting chamber foundation properly before the next seasonal nesting cycle. He submitted the report through standard compact documentation channels, flagged as supplementary to his original contract deliverable, and marked it, low urgency, no action required on my end. I read the report. I forwarded it to the warden team with an urgent flag, because it was urgent, and Vasquez's classification of low urgency was, I had come to understand, a characteristic artifact of his decision-making framework rather than an accurate assessment of importance. If something did not require his immediate action, he classified it as low urgency. The concept of things being urgent for other parties without being urgent for him appeared not to be fully integrated into his filing system. I sent him a message informing him that I had reflagged his report. He sent back, "Makes sense. Good catch." I looked at that response for a while. The Kelmari egg hatched 6 weeks after the collapse. Theron, the nest voice, sent a formal notification through the compact relay, addressed to the survey team. The notification was in Kelmari primary register, which the translation algorithm rendered, roughly, as, the voice that was waiting has spoken. The nest is complete. Nowak read it aloud at the team morning briefing and said, "That's very poetic." Then, Vasquez, "They're basically thanking you." Vasquez looked up from his geological survey maps. He had been eating something from a small sealed container, something orange, something that smelled sharp and chemical in a way that made my olfactory system produce the same low-grade alarm response it used for detecting reactive compounds. He said, "Oh." He looked at the notification on Nowak's screen. "That's nice." He went back to his maps. I have that morning briefing in my personal log. Audio and visual, both. I have watched it 12 times. There is nothing in it that changes. He looks at the notification, he says it's nice, he goes back to his maps, and that is the entirety of his response to being formally acknowledged by a Kelmari nest voice, which is an honor extended to perhaps 3 non-Kelmari individuals per standard cycle across the entire compact, most of them diplomats, most of them after years of relationship building and formal protocol exchange. He looked at it. He said it was nice. He went back to the geology.
I have filed my third incident report. My commanding officer has read it. She set it down and looked at me for a long time. I understand now why she did that. She was doing what I do when I look at the sensor log. She was watching something she had seen described and still finding that the description and the reality do not match, that the gap between them is the whole point, that the gap is not a failure of the description but a feature of the thing being described. There is a word in Velsha, my home dialect, the one my brood mother spoke, called Sevtherin. It means, approximately, the specific weight of carrying something you did not ask for and cannot put down. We use it for grief, usually. For the loss of a nestmate whose absence reshapes the space where they were. I have begun using it for other things. I think about the photograph in his harness pouch, the worn edges, the two small faces I could not see clearly, and I think about the cold coffee, and the cracked faceplate, and the 11 seconds it took him to cross a heat plume that my species would not have survived. I think about the egg, warm in his arms. I think about the expression on his face when Sev3 took it, and I still do not have the word, and I have stopped expecting to find one. The Compact's Human Affairs Office has requested a follow-up assessment meeting with my team in 42 days. Ferreira will be attending. I have already drafted 6 questions to ask her. I will probably not ask any of them. I have found that the questions I most want answered tend to be the ones that dissolve when I try to form them into language, which I suspect means they are the right questions, and also that I am going to need a longer time with them than I have had so far. Vasquez has already submitted his availability for the next Kelmari contract cycle. I submitted mine the same day. I am not sure what I am looking for. I am not sure looking for is the right frame. It is something more like going back to a place where something happened, not because you expect it to happen again, but because you are not finished with it yet. My 7th tympanic receptor, as of this writing, has not made the click sound again. I am not sure if that means I have finished processing, or if it means I have simply stopped being surprised. I have a standing hypothesis that those are not the same thing.